welcome to this week's episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Oren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
Joe Marcello couldn't be here today, so just Mike and I leading the charge on this Oren Only episode with the great Jack C. Harris.
So Jack Harris, as you may or may not know, was a big figure in the DC era of the 70s and 80s. You could see him writing, you could see him editing, very associated with the character of Wonder Woman, as well as other female characters of that time period. And, he, besides, Wonder Woman, he was editing when Black Lightning came about, Firestorm, Shade the Changing Man, these great characters, and also brought in a lot of talent, including the team of Mishkin and Cohn, who we had on previously, as well as Trevor Von Eden, as well as a little fella named Brian Boland, who we also had on. So just really an amazing figure from the DC eras past, as well as doing a lot of great work now. So looking forward to this Oren Only episode.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to Jack. I'd love to speak to him some more. And it's noted here, or he brings it up here, and it's become official since. He does have a book coming out with Tomorrow's Publishing about his interactions, his writing back and forth with Steve Ditko, who's become kind of a big name, I think. So it's really cool to hear stories about that. So enough of us. Here we go, Jack C. Harris. Jack C. Harris, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm so thrilled to speak to you. You've had such an incredible career. Just to start off from the beginning, from doing some research, first of all, thank you for your service. I know you were in the military for a while. And I think your audio might have dropped.
No, really?
Oh, no, I got it. Sorry, that was on my end. All right.
Oh, saying anything. That's why you couldn't hear me.
But again, thank you for your service. And you went from the military, if I understand correctly, to DC Comics?
Well, no, there was college in between.
Gotcha. So what was your first impression of getting to DC as a young man?
Well, I mean, I was a fan from, age 8 on, and always started out reading DC Comics. So those were my favorite. And there was a long process in applying, and I just happened to apply at the right time in the right way. And I was invited to be Murray Boltinoff's assistant editor, which I started. And there was a group of assistant editors at the time, all called from fandom, and we called ourselves the Woodchucks. And there was people like Bob Rozakis and Guy Lillian and Carl Gafford and people like that, Steve Mitchell, a few others that were all assistant editors working at DC Comics at the same time. So I knew them all by reputation. Ironically, I had met Paul Levitz and a bunch of others at the convention the year before I started working there. So I had met most of them before also, but I knew them by the reputation and the letter columns and everything. So it was almost like a fraternity a group. That's what we were. We were like a little comic book fraternity in DC Comics, the young kids, under the editorial staff of people like Julia Schwartz and Murray Boltinoff and other editors at the time. So it was like probably the best way I could describe it as an ongoing comic book convention, 24/7. Just all the time.
It must have been absolutely astounding to walk in the office and see some of the artists and writers that were there who were, the guys who sort of set the tone for comics to come.
Right. I mean, like I was there about 10 minutes and I met Joe Kubert for the first time. I mean, I walked in and, met Saul Harrison, who had actually hired me. And he introduced me to Murray, and Joe Kubert was in Murray's office, and Murray introduced me to Joe Kubert. So that was like the first 10 minutes I was there, I met Joe Kubert. So how you can get better than that? It's just couldn't.
It's top of the line right there.
And then, of course, Carmine Infantino was the publisher. So I've been a big fan of his, too, as well. So the first day, that's who I met, like right there, right away. So it was great.
Not too intimidating.
No, not at all.
Well, I'm curious, with coming from a fan's perspective, getting into the company, what did you think was working at DC, and what did you think as a fan could be improved upon with the books?
Well, it was very funny. DC at the time, in contrast to Marvel, kept their attention on newsstand sales at the time. Marvel was paying more attention to the letters they were receiving, and that's what they were responding to.
Right.
And he stepped back from that, which I thought as a fan, a bit of a mistake. And in hindsight, of course it was, but they thought that that's where the sales were. They could track their sales from the newsstand sales, not the fan mail.
Right.
You know, and that's where they sort of went off. The more of the fans who got into the business, the more that began to change. And but it took a while. So when I first got there, I thought that was the one thing that we were lacking, in that we didn't pay attention enough to the fans and the fan mail.
When did you start to really feel comfortable being there? Did it take a little while? Did you feel right off the bat?
About 10 minutes. Like I said, it was an ongoing comic convention. We were all instantly friends. It was terrific. You know, it just, I mean, the first day I was there, we all went to lunch together. And that became a tradition. The Woodchucks would go down. There was a cafeteria down in the complex beneath Warner Building where we were, and we'd all go there and have lunch together. And freelancers would join us as well. You know, people like Carrie Bates and Elliot Magan and Marty Pasco and all would all join us for lunch, and we would sit there and we'd discuss storylines. I mean, I remember plotting a Flash annual with the whole group of us there with Carrie Bates. We plotted one of the Flash annuals at lunch. It was great.
Do you ever think back now and say, you know, what a meeting of the minds those daily lunches were, when you think of the talent, yourself included, that was there?
Well, we thought about it at the time, but we didn't think it was as important as it ended up being. You know, looking back in history, oh my God, that was when this guy started and this guy came in, and that's where that idea came from. And we didn't think of it at the time. At the time, we were just having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You know,
so they come to you and they say they want you to do some writing for the book ISIS, I believe, one issue. Right. Nerve-wracking experience, or did you kind of?
I was there a year before I sold a script.
Okay.
Worked a year, and again, the first one I actually did was with Marty Pasco. He and I teamed together and did a issue of a Metalman. It was the first thing I ever did for him. And then when ISIS came along, I'm not sure of the order. I know I was writing Supergirl. At one point I was writing Supergirl and Batgirl and ISIS all at the same time. It was like I was the female expert at DC, and of course I wasn't, but they see that. And so when ISIS came along, I first dialogued one of Steve Skates' stories. He had plotted it, and I did the dialogue. And then I did a full issue myself, and then I took it over completely after that. Gotcha. Did all the scripts and had a lot of help along the way with people. I remember artist, I think it was Mike Vosberg, when he took my first script, he made little notes on the side. He says, shouldn't this be this way? And shouldn't you say it that way? And I go, yes, of course, you're right. And, you know, I took advice from everybody, you know.
That's a smart thing to do, you know, pick it up from wherever you can get it from.
And people who knew what they were doing before that I knew what I was doing. You know, so it was very helpful.
You just mentioned that you were given a lot of books for female characters. In your opinion, how were those books being handled before you got them by the previous writers?
Well, I don't know. It's kind of hard to think. I remember talking to someone, and I forget who it was, and it was a female, and she was vehement that Wonder Woman, for instance, should be written by a female. And my explanation, my counter to that was, well, if that's true, who's going to write, you know, Steve Trevor?
Right.
You know, I think a good writer has to be able to write in any gender, in any orientation. You should be able to write men, women, children, straights, gays, blacks, whites. It doesn't matter. A good writer should be able to do it all. And that's. I mean, I always look at Tony Isabella, who did Black Lightning, fabulously, right. And yet, as far as I know, Tony's not black, but he understands it all. He understands. He knows how to do it and make it convincing and along the way. And I think that's very important. So now, when the female characters, the way I handled Wonder Woman, one of the things I wanted to do was that I was never going to have Diana Prince come up against any obstacles because of her gender, which I considered was a fantasy. It was part of the fantasy because females certainly did come up against that. But I was thinking, what if you didn't? How would it go? Let's just pretend that she never encounters that. Maybe that was a mistake of looking back on it because I didn't address the issues. But I said, what if it was an idyllic world where she didn't have to worry about that kind of prejudice and that kind of a pre-thinking on how you should handle a female? And I thought it worked out pretty well. I mean, I made her an astronaut at one point, and I had a lot of fun with doing that.
And one thing you did is you took the character and jumped her to contemporary time.
Yeah, that's because that was what the television show was doing, I believe, at the time. Yeah. And I certainly wanted. I was really tired of the World War II stuff. Yeah. I really wanted to bring her because she was in the Justice League. She was active and things like that. She was having modern adventures. So I said, let's get her out of World War II. I wanted to do it spectacularly, so we did, the Wonder Woman Spectacular, and then the next issue, the first issue I wrote, we switched her back to modern day.
I'd heard from people who worked at DC that and there's no offense to the old guard that was there, but pushing a new idea like that could almost be like pushing a boulder up a hill, because if it worked, let's keep it working, and let's work. That
was a bit of that attitude going on. But again, we the freelancers, and again, I wasn't really one of the freelancers, but I hung around with them all. And again, I came from the fan base. We were all still fans of Marvel Comics too, and we could always say, look what they're doing, and they're doing it better than we are. Let's try that, and that was it was a bit of a struggle, but we could point to their success, and they said, yeah, well, maybe we should try that. And then on the other hand, Saul Harrison was very much into exploring new formats, which is how we came up with the dollar comics and the digest comics and the big tabloid size books. That was all Saul's idea. That's what he wanted to try, different formats. And I thought some of them were successful. I loved the famous first editions where they do these giant size reprints of Batman #1 and Superman #1 and Action Comics #1 and things you couldn't possibly own originally, but you got these wonderful exact reprints of them. And that was a format that Saul came up with. And that was an instance where Marvel would emulate us. We would do those first, and then Marvel said, yeah, it's a good idea, let's do it. And so we were back there. The freelance community was totally different than the two companies.
Yeah.
We were like a tight group, and we didn't care about company secrets and all that kind of crap. We shared everything. It was a great community that way.
And another project that you worked on that was sort of a new format, Madame Xanadu, for the direct market.
Yeah.
What did you think of the direct market and that sort of approach?
I thought it was genius, and I thought it would save the industry. Mm-hmm. I mean, Phil Sulik, who was the guy who came up with that, who ran all the conventions every July 4th for years and years and years. He came up with the direct market. He was the first one to say, look, why don't you just sell me these comics outright, and no returns. I won't return them to you. We'll just sell them until we sell them all. We'll just keep them until we sell them all. And so Paul Levitz and other people realized that was working. So then we said, well, let's do limited print run. We're going to just do enough books that we know beforehand we're going to sell. We put the word out there to the comic stores, and they give us back the numbers they think they can sell, and we'll print maybe 1,000 more than that, and that's it. So it really, really cut down on the print run, and therefore the money we spend it, plus we make all the profit back, guaranteed. We knew we were going to make it because we were selling the books outright, and we weren't going to have any returns on them. It was a really great system, and I think it saved the comics industry at the time.
Oh, most definitely. I consider you a very good writer. So, and you said before about good writers. So, and one of the reasons I say that is because you not only tackled the superhero books, you also did some work on war books. You did some work on horror books. And the questions I have is, I'll start with the war books. When writing a war book, how do you make it, I guess, entertaining, but still respectful of the history that it's coming from?
Well, I'll tell you how I did that. I actually had a subscription to a World War II history system. In fact, it was a whole system of cards that came in the mail, like a packet every month. If you can wait a second, I'll show them to you. They're right over there. Hold on a second. Here's one on Japan's headquarters. Here's one's the counterattack at Stalingrad, cards with information on the back and a picture on the front. Here's the armored car that they had in Germany, the Germans had. And I got these every month. And if you know, in the old days, Julie Schwartz used to take an artist and they draw a cover that they really liked, and then they give it to the writer and say, here's the cover, write a story about it. I did the same thing with these cards. I say, oh, here's a really cool weapon that you really don't hear about. I remember the one was one of the Gravedigger stories. There was a mini sub that the Germans had. So I said, let's do a story about the mini sub. It's cool. So like a one-man sub, it's cool, and I had a picture of it from the cards. And we wrote a story around that. So they were springboards. So that's how I did that. And looking back, and I just realized this recently, I wrote a lot of Gravedigger stories, like a whole lot. I didn't realize I had written that many of them until looking back on it and realizing, whoa, I did a lot of those. But they're almost all based on this set of cards that I had. And I started subscribing to that when I worked for Murray Boltinoff when we were working on GI Combat and the Haunted Tank and things like that.
Yes.
And I would research. So that all came from the research, and then creating the story was just like any other story. You had, all the elements of a story. You have a conflict. You had to resolve it. You had to twist the story somehow, make it, surprising. The whole surprise was the big thing. You had to be able to have a story where the reader could not predict the ending, so he was surprised with the end. Sometimes I would plot a story and I would show it to somebody, and they get to the end and I go, now what do you think is going to happen? Because I wouldn't show them the end. And if they couldn't get it, I said, good, I'm on the right track. You're going to be surprised was what I did. And if they did, I said, okay, I have to change it because you guessed the ending. So I have to figure out something else. So that's how we did it.
I would say, does that, I guess, theory or mindset also work with horror books that don't want them to get to the ending?
Right, you don't want to look at the old EC comics, were like that. They tried to get some sort of ironic twist ending. Unfortunately, if you do that too often, then you expect the unexpected. So then, you miss out on that. But still, a lot of them were like just absolutely wonderful stories. You just don't expect that ending. And you go, oh my God, And that was the fun stuff. That's why I like the old Twilight Zones from the Rob Sterling stuff. Same thing. My favorite episodes are the ones where I couldn't guess the ending.
Right.
Those are the ones I like the best.
As far as horror goes, do you prefer a straight horror story, or did you like some of the, like you mentioned EC, some of the shock comics they had where it was, it was horror, but it was a lot of graphic shock that kind of caught you off?
Either one, whichever worked in the story. Some it was just a horrifying incident, or sometimes you lose your head, which either way can go, and it depends on how much we could get away with. The thing about when I was writing it, you couldn't get away with the gore that EC got away with because they hadn't established the comics code at the time. So we weren't able to cut somebody's hand off, unless we do it like off panel where you didn't see it. you showed the reaction to it, but you didn't actually see it. That's what we do with hangings. A lot of times we didn't show anybody hanging. We could show their dangling feet. We could show the horrified crowd, but we couldn't show the actual hanging, but we could get around it. But again, it depends on the story. I mean, if a story, if the gore was the shock, then yeah, let's do it. But if it's not necessary, you don't have to do it. A lot of implied horror is scarier than the actual thing. That's why I liked a lot of the Lovecraft stories. Mm-hmm. Lovecraft would write a story and then he'd say, it was too horrible to describe. And then your mind just takes it away from there. And you're horrified more than he could ever do in words. So it was good.
Another aspect of writing is taking over a book from a well-known and established person. You did that with Kamandi.
Oh, yeah.
From Jack Kirby. Those had to be shoes that have been so big to
fit. My God, yeah. Well, luckily for me, first of all, there was Jerry Conway, who was in between Kirby and me, so he sort of smoothed out the bit. But one thing, and I always mention this, Kirby, in I think a Kamandi special or something, he drew a map of the Earth after disaster, very detailed map. Those were where I got all my story ideas from, was that map. It was just, and so I took right from Kirby. I said, okay, here's this. I don't know what he meant by some of it, but I said, okay, I'll use it. Like, and I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. There was a region in Africa, on his map called the Valley of the Screamers. And I said, now what in the world could that be? Because he never wrote that story. And I never got to write it either because the book was canceled. But my idea was this. I said, suppose it was elephants, because they scream with the trumpet and all. And I said, here's the dilemma. They evolved mentally, like all the other animals, but they still had those flat feet and the trunk, and it wasn't enough dexterity to create the things they can imagine. So they all went mad and spent the day screaming. And that was going to be the Valley of the Screamers. Yeah, you pull up from the great. You have Kirby. How can you go wrong by basing your stuff on stuff that he created before he left the book? So
did you ever get any feedback from him about your?
No, I never got to talk to Jack after I started working on that. No. Okay. I would have liked to. That would have been fun to see what he thought I was doing. I did get that. With Ditko. I mean, I got to talk to Ditko when I was doing a Spider-Man miniseries. Mm-hmm. So that was be able to see what he thought what I was doing, which is great.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to segue into. You had the foresight to bring back Steve Ditko for Shade the Changing Man.
I had nothing to do with bringing him back.
Really?
Steve brought that story, the first finished issue, to Joe Orlando.
Okay.
And Orlando brought it down to me and said he knew that Steve and I worked together on the Creeper and a few other things for World's Finest. And he says, do you want to edit this book? Steve Ditko is writing and drawing it. And you want to? And I go, of course. Why? I don't even have to look at it. Of course I want to do that. So, now, I'll tell you, I don't know. I guess I could tell you this. I'm writing a book about that.
Oh, cool.
About my work with Steve Ditko. Mm-hmm. More details to come later. But everything I did for Steve, there's lots of stuff I did with Steve. And I'm almost finished. In fact, I stopped writing the book to come talk to you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, Steve and I had a really good relationship. It was terrific.
Then this is for the right guy to ask. Nowadays, with social media, you have people speaking on behalf of Steve Ditko, people speaking about Steve Ditko who never knew the man, talking about his personality, talking about how he felt about certain things. As somebody who knew him, as somebody who worked with him, with all this going on, is it frustrating knowing what you know about him and hearing?
Sometimes I just sort of shake my head and go, no, that really wasn't like that at all. He was shy. That was his thing. He was shy. He didn't really like the spotlight. Mm-hmm. he would come in, and it's one of the things I talk about in the book. He would come into the DC office and he would hide in my office.
Right.
You know, he would sit there. The thing is, the way the offices were in DC, my office, the back was the window, the front was the hallway. So you could sit there in the front of my office and people could walk past and never see who was sitting in the office. You know, so Steve could sit there and nobody would bother him. And that's what he would do. Like if he would come in to deliver something to Paul Levitz or to Joe Orlando and they weren't there or they weren't available, he would come into my office and sit. And I saw just about everything he turned into DC first, before the editors ever saw it. He would show it to me first. And so that was great. You know, I got to see all this stuff before anybody else, you know. And that happened a lot in my office. I had notable people sitting in my chair in my office and no one knew it. I had a couple of funny instances. I remember one guy walks in and I forget who it was. He was talking to me for like 5 minutes, and then he glances over, and sitting in my chair is Christopher Reeve. Wow. You know, little things like that would happen all the time. Great.
That's a pretty cool life when Steve Ditko is just hanging out in your office.
Exactly. My mind is sitting there going, Steve Ditko is hanging out in my office. You know.
Well,
it had to be cool.
In your opinion, why didn't, if DC had a good working relationship with Steve Ditko at the time, was there a reason he wasn't pushed to the forefront with, you know, hey, Steve Ditko's here, we're going to have his take on Batman?
Again, they based everything on sales.
Gotcha.
And Shade the Changing Man, for instance, was not a big seller. I mean, it was not hugely popular. It has since become what I consider a cult classic. Looking back on it, people go, "Oh my God, that was great!" You know. But at the time, he was not the icon that he could have been. You know. And again, his own shyness pulled him back from that too. He really didn't want to, you know, be a superstar for the company. He really was not interested in doing that. He just wanted to do his work and do stories. That's all he wanted to do. You know. I mean, as far as I know, Steve liked to do two things. He liked to write comics and he liked to go to the movies. And that was it. That's basically all we ever talked about was the latest movies and old comics, you know.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, I think nothing wrong with that either. You know? So it's great.
And as an editor, you were at the helm for the first appearance of a number of characters, like Black Lightning, Firestorm. Right. Were there any characters that you saw come out that you thought this is going to be a hit, and for some reason it just didn't catch on as maybe you thought?
Not really. Most of like for instance, the two you mentioned, Firestorm and Black Lightning, were at fiascos, and with like 8 pages of new material. And then the sales came in and go, "Oh, you shouldn't do this. In fact, you should cut books," and the whole thing collapsed. So that's why those 2 books didn't make it. I always thought that actually I had more faith in Firestorm than I did in Black Lightning.
Okay.
But both of them I thought could have been really up there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's really nice to see them back. Both of them eventually hit TV, which I thought was great. Yeah.
It found a whole new audience and it sort of revived the older books again.
I thought that was great. The funny part of that was like, and I've told this story before too, and Al Milgram will argue with me, but I know this is what happened. Al came in with a whole bunch of costume designs, and I picked the most outrageous one I could, with that sunburst and the stripes across it and all that stuff. I said, "That's insane." I said, "Do you really want to draw this every panel?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, it's great." Said, "Okay, we'll see if they'll." I said, "I don't think they're going to pick that one," but they picked that one. And then to see it on TV where they actually had that design on his costume, and oh my God, who knew that was going to actually take off and be acceptable in some other media? It was just amazing.
I'll say that I had the Superpowers action figures as a kid, and the Firestorm with that outfit and the flame coming.
I always thought it should be a lighter. You know?
For kids, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Really
a lighter. Real fire though. Maybe not. Yeah.
You eventually make the jump to Marvel.
Well, not, but I went freelance.
Yeah, freelance. Did some work there. I've heard, again, I keep saying this, but we hear from people, it's two very different cultures at DC and Marvel. I guess it depends on the time period that you were at. Did you find it to be that way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, they did their stories differently.
Mhm.
DC was almost always a full script.
Mhm.
You wrote a script very much like a movie script, where you describe every page and every panel.
Mhm.
Marvel, the other way around. You described a plot, and then the artist would lay out and break down the whole story. Then it came back to you, and you had to put in the dialogue in the balloons and do it that way. It gave the writer less power to pace the story. The writers, that was up to the writer or the artists. And I liked it the other way. I like being a writer. I like better being able to pace the story my way rather than the Marvel way. But that's the way they did it. And their artists understood that too, so they could handle a plot thing. It was easy. But I thought a few times that I always thought we did it a couple of times at DC because the artists were used to that, and I always thought it like, for instance, in the Ray, Joe Quesada did the Ray, and he was had been from Marvel, and I thought he missed the mark in a couple of places. Like there was one I wanted really dramatic when you finally revealed the Ray's costume, and I always thought that should be the biggest panel on the page, but that didn't come out that way. It's like a smaller panel at the bottom. And I go, well, and it didn't come out the way I wanted it because I've envisioned it as a writer rather than as an artist. So
As a writer,
they both have their pros and cons, depending on what.
as a writer, did you prefer to have a lot of contact with your artist, sort of working hand in hand on a project, or did you prefer this is what I've written and you take it from there?
I loved going to the artist and saying, what do you want to draw? What do you like to draw? And it was a whole lot easier to be able to work that into a story, knowing that they were going to enjoy what they were writing or what they were drawing. I mean, I always thought it was like, okay, panel 1, 10,000 Indians are running over the hill, and that was all I had to write, and then he had like 2 weeks of work, trying to draw all 10,000 Indians. So I didn't envy them at all sometimes, but I always knew which artists could do that and which couldn't.
Right.
Like Dick Ayers was a great storyteller. You could put anything you wanted into now Dick wasn't the greatest artist in the world, but he was one of the greatest storytellers. He could put anything you wanted into a panel and make it work, and so yeah, it was much better to know who you were writing for than if you didn't.
When things start to change in, let's say, the late 80s, early 90s, and you start seeing the rise of the artist, the rock star artists and stuff like that, where they're the focus, was it tough for you to sort of change your approach, or did you just go with the flow and follow into that?
I just sort of went with the flow on it. I actually wrote more children's books during that period than I did comic books, because it was easier to deal with that,
right.
But yeah, I thought it was okay. What bothered me most was when they had these, like, some of the artists trying to write their stories. Some artists could do it, some could not, and it became really obvious sometimes and I actually paralleled it to the rise of computer games, because in a computer game, in a story, you have to get a character from position A to B to C to D and E. In a computer game, you have to get a character from A to Z. And you, the player, have to fill in the gaps. You have to get that character to get to the next position on your own. And some of those artists were writing stories like that. You can say, well, how did this character get to here? Oh, the readers can figure that out. I go, no, that's not the way I want to read a story. I don't want to have to fill in the gaps. That's not as satisfying as a nice, well-constructed story where you can see where they're going and why.
No, I 110% behind you on that. Most definitely. And I think you have a wonderful perspective, because you were there in the DC implosion. You saw sort of a low point in comics.
Very
Then
sad.
jump to when, no, and it's true, when you get to doing the Ray with Joe Quesada, that's part of the speculation boom, and comics couldn't have been bigger at the time.
Mhm.
What is there a point in either one of them that you kind of felt that things were changing for the better or for the worse?
Well, I thought it was always changing for the worst.
Mhm.
It was always getting worse. But then that's my, 8-year-old perspective. When I first read comics, it was like in the summer of '58. And if you ever go back and look at DC Comics, particularly in 1958, they were really, really good comics all the time. And even if you go back and read them with a very critical eye about today's perspective, they're still really good.
Yeah.
I mean, I've tried to do that. I go back and read the ones that I first read. I said, did I like this because I was 8 years old? Or did I like it because it was a really good story? And it's a little bit of both, but the really good story is still there. And I think that with what I said about the computer games and the I guess the emphasis on the art rather than the writing, I think it eventually harmed the industry irreparably, I believe. I mean, I remember reading a couple of 10 years ago now, a new issue of the Justice League. There's a relaunch of some version of the Justice League. I forget which one. And I read it and I go, this just doesn't make sense. One page did not flow into the next. Something happened. What happened between here and there? You don't know. There was no way to tell. And I reread it and I go, no, it still doesn't make sense. It's just wonderful, beautiful pictures. I mean, the artwork was stunning, but the story made no sense at all. And it just bothered me to see one of my favorite comic books basically go down the tubes as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, my friends, they get on me about this. I'm sort of a curmudgeon. I read books from 1993 and earlier. That's sort of my period and talking to folks who read books nowadays, it doesn't seem like writers ever want to have a long run on a book. They want to do this is my story, and then I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I think
it's very rare to
is
see a long.
Yeah, because things don't make sense because one writer might not follow what the other writer just did. So there's going to be that overlap that's not being filled.
Well, I mean, it's also where if you do a long run, then you can plan it all out.
Right.
Where I always thought it was better if you know where the story's going before you start writing it. And I've seen a lot of stories where you can tell, but they don't know where it's going in the next issue. They'll just sort of make it up as they go along, which of course is what writers do. We make it up as we go along, but it would be nice to sort of map out the path before you walk down it, So and then it was fun. Did you ever watch Fringe?
Yes.
The television Fringe.
Mm-hmm.
Fringe knew how that was going to end when they started writing it. And if you ever go back and watch the first episode of Fringe and the last episode of Fringe, this is a 5-year run, they refer back to the first episode in the last episode. And you realize, it all made sense. They knew where they were going from the very beginning, And if they didn't, it was convincing. Now, Stan Lee did the same thing, but he was sneaky about it, because what I remember is like the Inhumans, for instance. All right. First hint of the Inhumans was that they met the robot, the Sentry, right? They destroyed the Sentry. They didn't know where the hell the Sentry came from. It's just a robot buried in the ground. And it turned out that it was from the Kree. And then they sent Ronin to find out why in the world our Sentry was destroyed. Then why was the Sentry there? Well, the Sentry was there to monitor the Inhumans, which they had generated back millennia ago. And that's why the Sentry was there. Now, Stan Lee did not plan this ahead. Not at all. he had the Century, and then, well, why was there? Oh, wait a minute, the Inhumans, I invented those a while ago. Let's link them up and together, And that was, but when you read it in a straight line, it sounds like he had it planned from the beginning, and it works beautifully. He didn't, but he knows how to put it together, so it made you think that he did. And those are the best stories, especially when I first started reading comic books, there were never any continued stories. They were all self-contained stories. In fact, most of the Superman and Batman stories were 8 and 10-page stories contained in a single issue. You'd get 3 Batman stories, 3 Superman stories in every issue, and they were complete. They were, every so often they do a 3-part novel in Superman, which is weird because at the time they never did it in Batman. They only did Superman, was the only one they'd ever did the 3-part novels in. It was a full issue story. I always wanted them to do a 3-part full novel, as they called them, in a Batman, but they never did. And then Marvel was the one who started doing the one story leads to another, and they started doing that in the early Fantastic Fours. And then they started doing it across the line, and people started. But the trick that Stan Lee did was that he had a conflict and a resolution in every issue, and then he had enough plot lines to pick up on the next issue. So it felt like it was still the ongoing continuity. But at least you could pick up an issue and get a complete story, and you didn't feel cheated when, oh my God, continued. I can't, I have to go wait for the next month to see that. It was a great marketing ploy. If you want a story, you got to pay another 12 cents. So it works.
From what you just said, and I agree totally about having a start and a finish point in your head. But as a writer, sometimes, and looking at Wikipedia and your bibliography, you've done a couple of one-shot stories or kind of a spread out story in a book. Is it tough when you're just kind of thrown in mid-book and
fill-in issue?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sometimes those were tough because you had to pull in a little bit from the previous one and then give them enough to pick up on the other end. A lot of times the editor took care of that.
Okay.
I would write the full story and it's okay, I'm going to put another panel in here so that it can pick up in the next issue. Fine. That's fine. No problem with me. I don't care. That's good. In fact, I remember one time where I think it might have been a Green Arrow story that I wrote for World's Finest. And the editor linked it up to the next story. And in the next story, there was a new character being introduced. But since the mention of that character appeared in my story, I got the royalties for that character instead of the writer who created it for the next story. They actually, so that worked out pretty well for me.
One thing about editing that you also did is you helped develop and discover some new talent that has gone on to really make an impact in the comic world. I was saying, and well, you should be. What is it that you looked at in a writer or an artist that you felt needed to have the tools for success?
Well, the best example I think is Trevor Van Eden. Mm-hmm. We would get Bob Rozakis and I were somehow designated as the first line of defense for the creative part of DC. We would get all the slush work, the unsolicited material pulled in, and we were supposed to write the letters. Hey, very nice, go back to art school. Thank you very much. That was basically what we did most of the time. Same thing with the guys who would come up to the office. And Bob and I they'd send us out to meet with them in the lobby, and we decided whether they should go home or maybe we'll come in and talk to people. So Trevor Van Eden was like 15 years old, and he sent in a bunch of ballpoint pen drawings of superheroes. And I remember sitting at my desk, opening this, and I'm looking, Jesus, this is better than some of the stuff that we're publishing right now. This is really good stuff. And I remember going down to Joe Orlando. I said, look at this stuff. This is from some kid. And he goes, oh, tell him to come in. And Trevor came in, and before the day was over, he was drawing Black Lightning. It was just like that. That's what happened. And then the other ones I remember are Bob Smith and John Workman, who were buddies from Washington State. They came in on the same day. And I remember Bob Razakis and I going out and looking at the artwork and going, oh, look at this. These guys, they're pretty good, you know. And we went back. I remember going into Carmine's office. I think it was Carmine at the time. And we said, you should talk to these guys, you know. And before the end of the day, Bob was inking Ramona Fraden on Plastic Man, and John was working in the production room, you know. You know, it was just like that. It was just like great, you know. That was and to see them go on and do other great things was just great. Of course, and we all became great friends. I mean, John Workman's one of my best buddies now. You know, still to watch him win awards for his lettering and stuff is just great to watch. Yeah,
well, did that experience mentoring lead you into education?
I don't really recall. I might have. That actually came about with Denny O'Neil was teaching at the School of Visual Arts. And at the time I had left DC, I was freelancing, doing comics and children's books. And Denny wanted me to come in and talk to his class just to show you that, you know, it wasn't all just comics. You could expand and do other things as well. So I came in, he has a writing for comics class, and I went and talked and for a couple of years, I did that like twice. And then he wanted to stop that. So he recommended me to take over the class to the dean of students back then. So I went in, the dean interviewed me for about 10 minutes, and he goes, okay, it's yours. And eventually I did 3 classes for the School of Visual Arts over like 35 years, you know, that I worked for them. So that's how that came about. So the mentoring, yeah, helps, but that's how it happened.
Did you enjoy teaching and all that?
Absolutely. Just loved it. Just terrific. I had so much fun with that. Plus, I got people to come in and talk to my class, you know. So I get Paul Kupperberg to come in, and Mark Carlin came in, I think, once, and Mark Wade came in one time, and what was his name? Dylan Grayson or something like that. I forget. A couple of people. And they would come in, and I would get to meet them. And Scott McCloud, I believe, came in one time, you know. It was great. It was great just to meet all those people in that capacity, come in and talk to my class, you know. And then, of course, Denny came in as well, you know, so we traded off on that too. that was great. I love doing that. They gave me, when I was freelancing, it gave me an excuse to come into the city once a week, you know, because I taught on Thursday nights. It was evening classes. So I'd come in and spend the day. I would go down and have lunch with the guys at DC or Steve Ditko or whomever. And then I'd go up downtown to the school and teach. So my Thursdays was my New York day. So it was great.
It's a fun day. Hang lunch with Steve Ditko and then go teach. And
that's great. Could never get Steve to teach in my class, even though that's the school he graduated from. He would never do that.
Well. He's like you said, a shy person, and
very shy. Yeah.
You worked on so many characters. Were there ever any that A, you wanted to work on but didn't, or B, wish you had a longer run
on? Probably as an editor, I liked Green Lantern a lot, and I wish I had been able to do that longer than I did, because I really liked Green Lantern. Green Lantern was my favorite character as a kid. Him and Adam Strange. And Mike Gold tells a great story. When I did the Hawkman showcase, I did 3, and I teamed him up with Adam Strange. That was originally an Adam Strange story. But Jeanette Kahn didn't like Adam Strange. So Mike says, well, what if we do a Hawkman? He goes, okay, do Hawkman. She says, fine. So I did the exact same story, except I switched the emphasis from Adam to Hawkman. And we did that. You know. So I got to do both Hawkman and Adam Strange, which also 2 of my favorite characters. You know, so I can't think of anyone that I really wanted to do that I never did, except maybe Captain America, which I really love Captain America. And I always thought that Mark Gruenwald he loved Captain America as much as I did, and he wrote it, and he was really good at it, and I really loved his stories, and I loved that character. And I discovered Captain America by accident. It was I had some very old comic from the 40s, and there was an advertisement for a big 100-page comic, and it was an illustration with all these characters surrounding it, funny animals as well as superheroes. And one of them was Captain America, but I didn't know who he was. But then I heard the name. I said, that's got to be Captain America. That's the only name you could fit that character. And then my parents gave me that book from Jules Pfeiffer's Heroes, the world's greatest superhero, whatever it's called, and that reprinted Captain America's origin. And then, oh yeah, and then of course Marvel brought him back, and they had the wonderful series with Kirby doing it, and I couldn't get enough of Captain America. Love Captain America, but never got to writing.
Did you ever make the pitch for it while you were at Marvel, or was Captain America pretty sewn up at the time?
The only thing I did is I pitched a Red Skull series.
Yeah. That's awesome.
That's by Dick Ayers. The Red Skull. It says the most dangerous Marvel miniseries ever because it could happen. And so of course I had Captain America down on the bottom.
Yeah.
That was the only chance I had to ever write. They didn't go for this. They should have, because it was basically a Donald Trump story. But
Is there an artist or artists in particular that you felt whose art really connected so well with your writing?
Well, Ditko, for one, but Jose Delbo.
Okay.
On my Wonder Woman, he nailed it every time.
Wow.
And also on my graphic novel, The Batman and the Castle of the Bat, that Bo Hampton painted. I was laid up with a broken leg while I wrote that. And I would write it, and I would send it piecemeal off to Bo, because he had to paint every page. And every couple of weeks, I would get a package from Bo, and he had these color Xeroxes of the paintings that he had done. And there was one time where I opened the package, and I looked at it, and I go, I already have this page, and I looked through, and I didn't. And I realized that I had envisioned this page, and he created it exactly like I envisioned it. And I go, I saw that in my mind's eye before he even painted it, and he painted exactly what I was thinking about. So yeah, Bo Hampton really could read my mind when I was writing that book. It was great.
How did you handle the frustration of maybe an artist or art that you just didn't think was meshing with what you're writing? Did you have to say?
Well, I did it a couple of times when I was editing, and I fired them.
Oh.
They sent that out because that stinks. You're not doing that book anymore. We'll get somebody else to do it. Of course, as a writer, I couldn't do that.
Right.
I couldn't, as the editor. But I did it a few times. I remember twice when I did it. They had slated to do the story, and they sent it in, and it stunk. And I said, "No, we're getting somebody else. Sorry, you missed the boat."
Well, that takes me to a question I forgot to ask of. What was your editing style? Were you very direct with the people you work with? Because you were working with some big names. You're also working with young talent. You didn't want to disappoint anyone.
I'll tell you a story about that. Sometimes I would edit something, and they would get changed. And I would ask the editor, "Why did you change this?" And the answer I almost always got was, "It's better this way." Never any reason. They just said it was better this way. So the very first script I edited as an editor on my own was a Kamandi script by Denny O'Neil, my mentor, basically. And I said to myself, well, if I'm going to change something in Denny's script, I have to tell him why. So every time I made a change, I wrote my reason down in a little notebook. And it wasn't that many changes, but there were a few and that's why I did it. So when I gave the script back to Denny, and he read it over, and I'm all ready to explain my changes, and he goes, "That's fine," and he hands it back to me. But I never stopped doing that. From that point on, whenever I edited something, I always kept a notebook on why I was changing anything. And a few times someone asked me, and I had my reasons, and I told them exactly what I was doing, and they agreed with me. So yeah, of course, that's good. But I hated it when they changed it for no reason. I always got an impression from some editors that they weren't doing their job if they didn't change something. Even if it didn't need changing, we have to change something. I'm the editor, therefore we have to change something. I thought that was a bad philosophy to follow. I didn't like it. So I always made sure I made notes.
Did you prefer writing or editing?
Writing.
Right. Okay.
but it depending on the writers and the artists they're working with, you know. But it's always, it was, I mean, the same excitement was there. For instance, I remember doing one of the last things I edited for DC was the Green Lantern Corps miniseries, and Joe Staton was drawing it. And I remember being so excited when that artwork came in, because he did such a fabulous job on it. And I was so excited to see what he was going to do. But again, the excitement of waiting to see what your artist is going to do with a story you wrote, I mean, that's indescribable, especially when it comes back and it's better than you thought. Dick Ayers used to do that on my Kamandies. He would do it better than I envisioned. It was just like, he would just floor me. And it's just like, oh my God, I didn't think it would look that way, but that's great. You know, I would just get so excited about it. It was wonderful.
Where can fans find you on social media or website or anything like that?
I'm on Facebook. If you put my name in, I'll turn up. I'll answer something to someone if I have a specific question. A lot of times I'll respond to something someone posted about something that I wrote. And usually I put, you know, this is my favorite book. And I liked it. And that's usually what I say. I liked it. And fans will see that and they will contact me. Like last night, something happened to me. And there's some guy was doing a live YouTube where he was drawing, you know, and doing it live. So I clicked on it to see what he was doing. And he announces my presence. And I go, okay, bye. And I clicked off. Don't do that. That's, if you want to be there, fine, I'm there. But you don't have to sit there and announce it to everybody.
Oh, so, you're a big deal, sir. You got it.
He lost out on that one. But yeah, if someone, you know, drops me a note in Facebook, I'll usually answer it. You know?
Okay. And you got the book.
Nothing in great detail, but you know, if I'm sitting there looking at it anyway, I'll definitely respond to it.
And you're working on the book that you were saying earlier. That's
almost finished. I'm on the last chapter. You know, it's for Tomorrows.
Oh, okay, great. They're a wonderful publisher.
Yes, they are. Yes, it should be good.
Well,
in fact, I'm turning in the manuscript physically at the Baltimore Comic Convention.
Wow. All right, that's coming up pretty soon.
Yep, got to get finished.
Well, I don't want to keep you. I just wanted to say, you know, thank you again for all that you've done for us comic fans, comic community.
Yep.
And we are back. So yeah, really love this interview. Jack has experience. He's been part of so many wonderful things in not only DC history, comic history, the people he's worked with, the comics that he worked on, and really his editorial style, which I think brought the best out of so many talented people.
Yeah, really enjoyed this interview, Oren. As we all know, you know, the Oren Only episodes are just just special stuff, exclusive to the Dollar Bin Bandits podcast, by the way. You'll never see an Oren Only episode anywhere else. But that will do it. You know, thank you, Jack C. Harris, for coming on the show. I think it was a great interview, very illuminating of many issues, many characters. And it's great to hear that he has this other project coming out very soon. So that's great. Be on the lookout for that. But for everybody else, thank you for listening. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.